Shalom everybody, welcome to our weekly class, Tuesday evenings, right here in Yerushalayim, in Rechavia, Chabad of Rechavia. Welcome everybody to our shir, and learning Torah, learning a Torah shir. It's a great opportunity to invite everybody to join us this coming Wednesday, not tomorrow, next week Wednesday, March 2nd, Erev Rosh Chodesh Adar Sheni, welcoming our new Torah, new community Torah. And it's going to be an amazing event. We put a lot of effort into it, and Mirz Hashem will be very, very memorable, even for Jerusalem standards. Bezrat Hashem. So now we're up to, we've been learning this mimer, this Chassidut Discourse, since after Hanukkah, and I'm so happy that I began it then, because we're just inching towards the explanation and towards the last couple of paragraphs of Simanim. We're up to paragraph Zayin, number 7. In the English Ma'amar, the English book of Ma'amarim, it's page 338. So you can look into your Sfarim. And Bezrat Hashem, we're going to try really hard from now on to try to use actual Sfarim, so it helps us to be more committed and dedicated to this shir. I think it was an excellent decision that we made. And if anybody wants to have some drinks, you're welcome to have some. And there are quite a bit more upstairs. This mimer deals with the name of the Chag. The name of the Chag is Purim, which Purim seems to be the opposite of the salvation. The salvation was that Hashem helped Am Yisroel despite all odds, and it doesn't seem to make sense that the name of the Chag should be Purim, which really means the source of the problem. That Haman made a lottery, and through this lottery he chose a month, chose a date, and that was his fuel for God forbid planning to annihilate all of Am Yisrael. And so it sounds funny to call a Chag the name of that which made the problem. And we spoke at great length, we learned at great length in this mimer from 1953 that the Rebbe said on Purim that really Purim being a lottery is really the source of the solution. It seems to be the source of the problem, but it's really the source of the solution, because what does it mean to have a lottery? A lottery means to tap into something which is totally beyond our understanding, our rationale. And by doing that, we're tapping into our own deepest core, and through tapping into our deepest core, we reach the atzmut of Hashem, the essence, so to speak, of Hashem. And the reason why, how does this connect to the lottery that Haman made? That connects that Haman knew all of this Kabbalistic interpretation, and he, Dafka, specifically made this lottery because he thought he'd be able to reach into that, but he didn't realize that he's not part of Am Yisrael, and therefore he doesn't have the ability to tap deep down into the deepest levels of godliness.
Did Haman know that he was part of a Malach?
It's a great question. Possibly, but I don't know for sure. In other words, when we talk about things like this, where Haman knew Kabbalah, we don't know exactly what he knew. Even on the other side, when it comes to a tzaddik, and we say a tzaddik has Ruach HaKodesh, divine inspiration, or the tzaddik has prophecy, or the like, we don't know exactly, we can't identify exactly what the tzaddik knows or what the tzaddik knew. So we could say, hey, if the tzaddik knew this, so why didn't he know that? As if we know how it works up there in the deeper realms. We don't begin to understand how this whole thing works. So we can't really ask, you can ask all you want, but we can't expect to understand how it works on the higher realms. But in this case, for sure, it's harder for us to understand, because the whole idea that Haman knew these Kabbalistic concepts is a totally new concept. At least by a tzaddik, we know, we can assume, we can expect that, we can assume that the tzaddik has a high level of Ruach HaKodesh, of divine inspiration. So now we're on page 333. And let's begin. V'yesh lomar, just beneath the line, first we read the Hebrew, then we read the translation in the English. If you're missing 338, just wait a couple of moments, please, and then we'll come to 340. V'yesh lomar, it's possible to explain the hatam al zeh, that the reason for the fact shehaman hipilpur, that Haman cast a lot, in order to reach the level of a lottery that transcends Seder Shtalshalut, which is the chain-like structure of existence. Even though at that time, the days of Achashverosh, even before Haman cast the lot, everything that transpired was controlled by godly light that transcends Seder Shtalshalut, a level at which darkness and light are the same. Remember we talked about the fact that Laila Kayom Ya'ir, that the night shines like the day. That's when Mashiach comes. That the darkness is not going to be a concealment. On the contrary, the darkness is going to be part of the awesome, the great, intense light, luminary, which is going to shine when Mashiach comes. So, Haita Naga, everything that transpired was controlled by godly light that transcends the Hishtalshalut. Hu lefi shebechinat hagoral hu l'malu yoter bebechinat hachashverosh. Is because the lottery represents a rung that is loftier even than the rung represented by Achashverosh. So we mentioned in the earlier classes, and I'm going to remind you that when we talk about Achashverosh, we're not just talking about Achashverosh the way he is down here in this world. We're talking about Achashverosh like we learned last week, Acharit Vereshit Shalom, that the end and the beginning is all his. In other words, Hashem always was, always will be. He is the beginning. He didn't start. He was always here. And the end, which is He will forever be here, that's also Hashem. So, on one hand, you're talking about a very great level of spirituality. Obviously, in Achashverosh's source. Not the way he came down here. The way he came down here was awful. He was a wicked Rasha. But in his source, he represented a very, very high level. And so, we also talked about that the Goral, the lottery, is not only higher than rationale, which is in the language of Kabbalah, we talked about the Ratzon, the will. So for example, Hashem has Chochmah Bin Adat, the three levels of intellect, but it's totally not the same type of intellect that we know it to be, totally Ein Sof, infinite. The Ratzon, the will, we talked about, is higher than intellect. Then we talked about the fact that when we talk over here about Goral, lottery, we're not just talking about higher than intellect. We're talking about the Baal Haratzon, the initiator, the master of the will. Oh, that's a whole other story. So Haman knew at some stage of the game, he knew or he was aware that Hashem was running the world in a super rational way. But he didn't realize that Am Yisroel has the power to reach even a higher level. In other words, higher than super rational. It's also super rational, obviously, but it's even higher than the regular super rational. Super rational level is the Ratzon, is the will. If someone says, I want something, but it doesn't make sense. It doesn't matter. I want it. I want chocolate. Yeah, but you're going to gain weight. Doesn't matter. I want it. Don't ask any questions. That's called super rational. It's higher. Don't ask questions if someone wants chocolate. It's just don't get between a person and chocolate. It's like danger zone. But then you have something which is even higher than L'mayla mitam v'dat, which is the essence, which is the Baal Haratzon, the master of the will. So where does Achashverosh come from? We're inching towards the bottom of the page. Mi Sha'acharit v'reshit shelo. The one to whom the end and the beginning belong to him. They're his. That's Hashem. Only Hashem is from the beginning and before that, and until the end and after that. So we have to understand this. And now the Rebbe is going to explain. To explain this concept, the very fact that this rung, this level is identified with Achashverosh, the one to whom and the end and the beginning belong, Muchach is clear, indicates, Shegam legabei yeshnam ha'inyanim da'achrit v'reshit. So you say, Hashem is so great that the end and the beginning, or in other words, the beginning and the end, is all His. And everything in between, forever, from whatever was and whatever will be, is all His. It sounds wonderful. We're putting in the same breath, we're putting Acharit V'Reshit, the end and the beginning, or the beginning and the end. But the fact itself that you're identifying, that you're describing end and beginning and end and ending. So you're giving legitimacy, you're giving space for these terminologies. So true that you were including the beginning and the end is all one big mishkabab, one big cholent. It's all his. He doesn't. For him, everything in the middle is all a bunch of big cholent. But so we're trying to say how great Hashem is, right? Hashem is so awesome. Hashem is so great that the beginning and the end is His. But you're still identifying, you're still describing the word beginning and end. Let me give you an example. Remember we talked in one of the earlier classes about the whole idea of a name. That the name doesn't really, it alludes to a person, a thing, but it's not the person himself. The person himself, if they were to be on an island, they don't need to have a name, because the name isn't connected. They need to know Yisroel. Oh, your name is Yisroel. Very nice. Now I can call you. How you doing? Good morning. But if someone is alone on an island, who's going to call you good morning? You're just alone. You seemingly don't need to have a name. That's why we explained that Hashem has several names. Yud Kei Vav Kei, the tetragrammaton Elokim, Aleph Lamed, Kel, Shin Daled Yud, a number of names. Each name is how He expressed Himself, but it's only a name. It's great, it's holy, we're not allowed to even say the words, but it's nonetheless only a name. Here's the point that I'm trying to explain. One of the best things that I like about Chassidut is that in every mimer, in every discourse, you have the same focus. What's the focus? Each mimer in its own text, in its own style. You have this pasuk or this chag, and it represents this level and a higher level, and they're all wonderful. But here's the bottom line: the same common denominator. But Hashem Himself, in His essence, is indescribable. So you could talking about Chachma. In one mimer, you talk about how great Chachma is. The first level of the first world of Atzilut. We talked about a few weeks ago in the Torah Or from the Alter Rebbe. What's the point? As high as it is, the Atzilut essence of Hashem is even higher. Any level you'll talk about, you're always going to get back to the same bottom line. Wow, it's amazing. Malchut is awesome, but what's its source? Its source is directly the essence of Hashem. So it's always going to come to the same thing over here. We're talking about rationale, and then you talk about super rational, higher than understanding. For example, Achashverosh. But you want to say how the lottery, the goral, the poor of Purim, the poor, is so powerful. So that's the point. The point is that because we were crushed, Am Yisroel unfortunately was crushed, and we're at an all-time low, Dafka through that, we're able to stand up and reach the essence like an olive. You want to squeeze out the pure drop of clean oil? You squeeze it until it comes a beautiful drop that doesn't have any what's it called?
Moist.
Contamination.
No, there's little pieces, little
Sediment.
sediment. It doesn't have anything in it. It's just pure. So that's what Hashem did in the case of Purim, that we were able to come out with flying colors. Ella, top of 339. Ella shehem shavim legabe. So if you talk about, but in relation to the level connoted by Achashverosh, they are equal. So what are we saying? We're saying that Achashverosh, you're right, it represents a very high level, which is super rational. But Haman thought that he had already reached that level. But he didn't realize that only Am Yisroel has the power to reach the highest level of the Goral of the poor. Now we're going to bring an example by divine providence. In these parshas now, we're reading about the contributions to the Mishkan, to the tabernacles, and we're going to learn about right now about how this relates to our subject. In this next paragraph, to cite a parallel in the Mishkan, the sanctuary that accompanied the Jews in their journey throughout the desert, Hashem's infinite light shined forth, and its revelation extended even to the lowest possible levels, even to inanimate matter. For example, it says that the Beit HaMikdash, if you look at what the Mishkan was made of, mainly of tzomeach. There are 4 substances that Hashem created the world with. Domem, inanimate objects. Excuse me. Tzomeach, something that grows. Chai, like an animal, something that's alive. And medaber speaks, but it means a person. So each one has more life to it. Obviously, also, in inanimate objects, there is also life. So if you look at the Mishkan, the tabernacle, versus the Beit HaMikdash, it seems to be that the Mishkan is greater, because the Mishkan was made from cedar trees, which is tzomeach, something which grows. You have chai, the parochet, the overhanging, which was made from the skin of the animals. So once you have the chai. But what was the Beit HaMikdash made of? It was made of domim, inanimate objects. That was stone. We see right over here in Yerushalayim, right by the kotel, the huge stones that built even the outside wall. That's the kotel, but also including the Beit HaMikdash itself. So at first glance, which one is higher, the Beit HaMikdash or the Mishkan? It seems to be the Mishkan, because the Mishkan was on a higher level. But really, the Beit HaMikdash is higher. First of all, because the lower the substance is, the higher source it has. Like we learned in the past about Haman and Achashverosh, that they represent a higher source. And now we're learning, moreover, that Hashem wants specifically to have an abode, a home, in the lowest places. So the Mishkan was a good beginning, but the Beis HaMikdash, the temple, was even more of a goal. And when Mashiach comes, apparently the third Beit HaMikdash is going to include both domem, inanimate objects, if I'm not mistaken, also tzomeach and chai. In other words, it's going to represent that we've prepared for the coming of Mashiach through all of the generations. Each generation had its preparation. Some like by the Mishkan, it was higher levels, and now we're more into domem, into inanimate objects. The end of the third line, the line of this paragraph. Nevertheless, the sanctuary was constructed in a manner that reflected the distinctions between the different levels of existence in this world. The roof of the sanctuary was made from the hides of rams, techashim, and goats and their wool. The animal kingdom. Right? So we talked about domim, tzomeach, chai. So the chai, that which comes from an animal, is above. It's on top. In the Mishkan, it would hang over the walls. That was like the roof, so to speak, and it would hang over the walls, the poles, the pillars. The walls, wooden boards, were from the plant kingdom, and the plant kingdom. Okay, so that was the trees. It came from trees. And the floor of the sanctuary was earth, inanimate matter. That was the floor. That was by default. It wasn't something that they had to make. The Beit HaMikdash was, the walls itself were from not just by the way obviously standing on earth, which is domem, inanimate object. Although an infinite light that transcends all distinction was revealed, the manner in which it was revealed reflected the hierarchy that exists between the different levels of existence. So, at this level of the Mishkan, you had the Ein Sof, the light of Hashem, which shone v'shachanti b'tocham, that Hashem rested. Hashem revealed Himself in this world through the Mishkan. So basically, you had a level of godliness which surpassed all the different levels. Domem, Tzomech, and Chai. It was able to rest within the Mishkan. This concept is also reflected in the Purim narrative. In the first chapter it says that Achashverosh made a feast, a celebration for all his officers and servants. And only afterwards for all the people found in Shushan. It is explained in Likutei Torah שהגילוי שהיה לכל העם היה למטה במדרגה מהגילוי שהיה לשריו ועבדיו. That the revelation to all the people was on a lower level than granted to the officers and servants. Moreover, it can be said, within the revelation granted to all the people itself, there were differences. Now we turn to page 340. There were several different levels. Haroi lagina. Haroi labitan. Different people were on different levels. They could join in closer and closer to the king. As reflected in our sages' words in the Talmud, those worthy of entering the courtyard were assigned to the courtyard. Those worthy of the garden were assigned to the garden. And those worthy of the pavilion to the pavilion. Just as on the material plane, Achashverosh made distinctions among the people, so too in the spiritual parallel there are distinctions. V'yesh lomar, it is possible to say, shemitzad b'chinat ha'ishtalshalut, that according to the structure of the seder ishtalshalut, of the chain-like structure of existence, hagilui hu rak l'sarim v'avadim. Revelation is granted only to the officers and servants. The fact that revelation was also extended to all the people, including those who are worthy only of being in the courtyard, was because the revelation was from the level of Achashverosh. That the one to whom the end and the beginning belong, which means a level of godly light that transcends the structure of Seder Shtalshalos. Nevertheless, the revelation to the people, quote unquote, was on a lower level than the revelation of his officers and servants. So even though it was a high level, there was still differences between them. You would expect that since it's such a high level of higher than the rationale, then maybe everyone should have the same. Nevertheless, because it wasn't such a high level, it wasn't yet the level of Purim, of Pur, it still needed to be, each one should get according to their own level. 341, and there were also several levels within the revelation to the people. Because the fact that the end and the beginning belong to him applies that in relation to him, the end and the beginning are the same. However, with regard to the revelation of his light in the world, in the higher realms, the beginning, his light is revealed more than in the lower realms, the end. So in other words, to summarize this point before we go on, whatever high level of Ein Sof, well, not really of Ein Sof, of higher than higher than chain-like. Let me get the right words. Chain-like structure of existence. You want to say there was a higher than the Shtalshalut? It still was within the realm. For example, like we said before, Acharit Vereshit, recognizing the description of beginning and end. It's not totally super rational. Now let's continue. What did we accomplish through the Goral, through the lottery, through the poor? By contrast, on the level alluded to by the lottery, that's a whole other story. Totally another story. From the very outset, there is no distinction between the beginning and the end. This can be understood from the fact that in general, a lottery is made when there are two equal choices. It has to be equal. Because if it's not equal, then they'll say, oh, you know why he got it or why he wanted it? Because this one liked more than the other. But Goral is when you have two exactly perfectly equal things, and nevertheless, one is chosen for this and one is chosen for that. For example, Yom Kippur, 2 sheep, 2 goats, which are exactly the same. The lottery is taken, and one goes La Hashem to be a Korban, another one goes La Azazel. Kanal Sivbet, as stated earlier in section 2 above. Bottom paragraph of 341. A relationship similar to that which prevails with regard to the concepts of beginning and the end, which is the hierarchy of what is above and what is below. 342. The similar analogy can be drawn to the difference between holiness, the holy realm, and the Sitra Achra, which is the other side, quote unquote, the impure powers. Shemitzad hadarga da Achashverosh, from the standpoint of the level of Achashverosh, yesh chiluk ben kedusha le Sitra Achra. There is a distinction between holiness and Sitra Achra. Ela shemitzad haromim utshelo ein ze tafos makom kol kach, ein ze tofes makom kol kach, because he is so, and this it is only that because of its lofty nature, this distinction is not given that much importance. Therefore, it is possible that nurture will be granted to the Sitra Achra. At the end of the day, every single object in the world needs to have its life force from holiness in some way, shape, or form. That's why the Ramban says that when we talk about in the Shema, we talk about how Hashem is upset at us when, if God forbid, if we serve idols, chas v'shalom. So Elokim acherim, we don't say Elokim with a hey. Some do, but we don't. The Nachmanides says we say with a kuf, as if we're talking about Hashem. We're talking about idols. It's the same word, but why do we have to change the letters a little bit not to say the word? We're not talking about Hashem. We're talking about the exact antithesis of Hashem. Answer is that every single thing in the world needs to get its life force from kedusha, from holiness in some way, shape, or form. So this way, even such a thing which seems to be the exact opposite of kedusha, also that needs kedusha in order to survive, in order to be sustained. Otherwise, it wouldn't have any place. It wouldn't have any achiza, nothing to hold on to. The klipas noga, we talked before about achash leirosh. Chash, one of the translations is to be quiet. So chash, the klipat noga, verosh, the gimel klipas atmayas. That's a very, very deep concept in the Kabbalah. So let's continue. Va'ad shetiyeh gabrut hasitra achra al kedusha hushchuru pneim shel Yisroel. Unfortunately, it was the Am Yisrael, their faces darkened. That's how bad spiritually their level reached. That's how low they reached. You couldn't tell any shine on their faces. You couldn't tell any radiance, because they had sunk deep down into the deeper levels of Sitra Achra, which is the opposite of Kedusha. Just one second, let me just finish the concept, and I'll be happy to take some questions. V'yesh lomar, please remember what you want to say. V'yesh lomar al derech shlamit biyadayim tiktafes, v'hi be'echlei hamelech. It is possible to explain the above based on the interpretation of the verse. The spider seizes its prey with its hands, while it is in the palace of the king. So the shmamit, the spider, is compared to the klipa, the sitra achra, the evil powers, and it tries to not take over, but it tries to be active, even in the chamber of the king. Where the chamber of the king, you should run away. It shouldn't have anything to do with the chamber. The chamber of the king represents kedusha, but nevertheless, it tries to creep into different levels of holiness. Even though it soils the palace, the spider is not driven away. Since because of his lofty nature, the king does not concern himself with driving it away. In an ordinary home, a spider's presence would be noticed and it would be removed. By contrast, because the palace of the king is so great, and the king and his attendants are concerned with much loftier matters, so the spider's presence draws little attention. To extend the above analogy, as long as the spider makes its webs in a corner, it will go unnoticed. If, however, it makes its presence obvious, the king will certainly have it removed. Similarly, the spiritual gestalt, is that the word? Associated with Achashverosh allowed for the possibility of the Jews to be oppressed. So because but not for them to be annihilated entirely. Heaven forbid. There was a possibility for Am Yisrael, unfortunately, to reach very, very low levels. Therefore, when Haman sought to annihilate all the Jews, heaven forbid, he cast the lot, which means he felt it necessary to access even a loftier and more transcendent rung of godliness. He thought he'll be successful. The kivan shebebchinat hagoral ein milechatchila chiluk ben kedusha l'sitra achra. His reasoning was that from the level of the lottery at the outset, there is no difference between holiness and sitra achra. Specifically, as we explained earlier, that the lottery represents not only a rung that transcends seder shtalshalut, but also above God's desire for the Torah and its mitzvah. Like we said, you think obviously we have to do the Torah, learn the Torah and do the mitzvah, but does it really make a difference to him? We do it because he wants us to do it, but he's much higher than us. Making a real difference through our little actions. Therefore, Haman thought that in this way his evil designs would prevail, heaven forbid. Let's finish off by accessing a level that is totally above all structure and definition, where there is no difference between darkness and light. Haman thought that he would be able to snuff out godly light in the world by utterly destroying the Jewish people, God forbid. Logic would appear to dictate that since the world has no independent existence and is brought into being by Hashem, so everything in the world should conform to His will as reflected in the Torah. And if the Torah is not kept, then it got, like the Am Yisrael did at that time, the majority did not really keep Torah and mitzvot, unfortunately, then God forbid, Am Yisrael should be annihilated. But God is God. He doesn't have to confine Himself to what we understand as logical. To emphasize that it is His world, reflecting His own being, He allows for the possibility that events will occur that do not conform to the scales of spiritual logic. He can still keep us. He's locked into Am Yisrael. There's no way that He's going to make any change. He's committed to the fact that Am Yisrael is going to be here forever. So even though if you're going to try to find some logic, God forbid, that Am Yisrael should be able to be annihilated, ultimately, as far as the poor as far as the lottery is concerned, there's no way in the world we are so deeply connected to Hashem on the highest, most essential, the deepest level, that there's no way that Am Yisrael will ever go away. Okay, I just want to mention one very interesting thing that I read recently, which really can add a lot to this whole idea that we talked about over here, that no matter how low we fall, Hashem will always be able to lift us up. There was a great tzaddik, the Maram of Rothenburg. I believe he lived, I think he was a Rishon. He must have lived approximately, we're on camera, so I want to be more exact. I don't know, but I can find out for you, Bezrat Hashem, for the next year. The Maram of Rothenburg was a great tzaddik, a very leading halachic authority in his hundreds of years ago, and unfortunately he was taken away by the enemies of Am Yisrael, and they wanted a very high ransom, and he did not allow them to pay the ransom, and he unfortunately passed away in captivity. So he
passed away in the prison, and some rich Jew paid to have his body taken out to be properly buried.
Correct. It's a very interesting thing that I hope I'm saying the details correctly. That afterwards the Maram of Rothenburg came to this Jew in a dream, and he asked him, would you like to become very rich, or do you want to have a portion in the world to come, a really beautiful portion of the world to come? And so he said, it's more important to have a portion of the world to come, which is the world of truth, it's the world of eternity. And so when the Rebbe told over the story, the Rebbe said that the Maram of Rothenburg, if he would have lived after the Baal Shem Tov's time, then he would have chosen the other one. He would have chosen to have, I believe it was to be rich. Why? Because what's the whole? This is such an amazing insight. What's the underlining point of the teachings of Chassidus? That when Hashem chose this world, where did He choose a place to have His abode? Specifically in this physical world, because even though it seems to be the lowest world, it really is the highest. Like we said earlier in the shir, that the inanimate objects are really, their source is even higher than the ones that are greater, and that's really a common denominator which you find through every single concept. As high as everything is, really Hashem, Shlomo HaMelech himself says, I'm going to build a house for you, but Hashem really needs to have a house. Hashem needs to have even Shlomo HaMelech with all his wisdom couldn't understand it. It is hard to understand how it's possible that Hashem should need, quote unquote need, doesn't really need it, but He decided that He needs a home in this physical world. And so if we realize how important this world is, then we would want to invest as much as we want to be successful in whatever we do, even in the most materialistic things. Not only, it's not like we go to daven in a shul, or we go to learn in a shir, and then we go to work, and then we're doing on a much lower level. On the contrary, when we go to work, in a sense, we're accomplishing much more than we accomplish in shul and in the Beit Midrash. Don't get me wrong; it's very important to be in shul and the Beit Midrash, but there is something really special about going out to the world. So that's where that's ad kedei kach, to the extent that the Rebbe said that if Maram of Rothenburg would have been after the Baal Shem Tov, then he would have chosen to be wealthy and to accomplish more things in this materialistic world. It's worth even more than all of the greatest Gan Eden and paradise in the world to come. So there was another tzaddik. His name was, one second. His name was Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom, he was called Rabbeinu Gershom Ma'or HaGola. He lived about 1,000 years ago, even before Rashi. Rabbeinu Gershom has commentaries very from the leading Rishonim of all times, and he was called Ma'or HaGola, the light, the luminary of exile. There were two things. There were two major takanot, that he instituted in Am Yisroel. Maybe it was only. Could be, I'm confused. Okay, the famous takana that the Rabbi Gershom said was that it was according to Torah, a married woman cannot be married to another man at the same time. But a married man, according to Torah, is allowed to be married to more than one wife. Till today, the Sfardim, they're allowed to have more than one wife. But the Ashkenazim have taken on the takana of Rabbeinu Gershom. He said that we should not have more than one wife. Now I believe it was for 1,000 years. I think the 1,000 years ended about or a few years before that, within the last 30 years. And of course, all of the leading rabbis in the world extended this takana ongoing. They reinstated it. So the reason why Rabbeinu Gershom is called Me'or HaGolah, the luminary of Galut, is because the idea of Galut, the halachot that we have in the Torah, are not just in the literal sense, but are also in the metaphoric sense. So we are Hashem's wife, bride. Hashem is the Chatan, and we are the Kala. Now, Hashem is dedicated to us only exclusively to have one wife. Now, according to Torah, according to the Chumash, the Torah, the written Torah, one is allowed to have more than one wife. But Rabbeinu Gershom saw that it's on the literal sense that it was not working out, and it was not, and it was more appropriate for one man to be married to one wife. And so HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Magid Dvarav Li'Yakov, Chukav U'Mishpatav Yisroel. Hashem tells us what to do, so He Himself does what He tells us to do. So if this is His Torah, Rabbeinu Gershom didn't make it up, he was a tzaddik. It was divine inspiration. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu, through Rabbeinu Gershom, decided that he should make this takana, gave him the inspiration. So Hashem too will never entertain another kala, another bride, another wife, because that's what Rabbeinu Gershom said. So he is the Me'or HaGolah, he is the luminary of the Galut, which helps us keep focused to understand that in this Galut, sometimes it seems very, very dark, the exile, and we look at ourselves and we say, when is Mashiach going to come already? We're doing everything we can, and Mashiach should come immediately. And so when we learn about this point, that which Rabbeinu Gershom instituted, that a man should have only one wife, so this is an encouragement. It's a luminary. It gives us hope and more focus that Bezrat Hashem is bonded with us forever. Hashem will never exchange us for any other nation, and will never even add on another nation. We are Hashem's bride, and that's the end of the conversation. So in our case about the story of Purim, we have to remember that we see this clearly, that even though Am Yisroel had really unfortunately sinned, it came to a very, very low level. Nevertheless, we are sure, we are confident, and that's what happened at the time, that Hashem did not allow Haman's calculations to come into play, like we learned today, that he thought he's going to go according to higher than sechel, higher than rationale. But we have the true power to tap into our etzem, to tap into our essence, which ultimately connects with Hashem's essence. Thank you very much for joining us. B'ezrat Hashem, next week we're going to have a lecture. It's going to be the night before our big event for the Achanasat Sefer Torah. So we're going to have a lecture. The information will be coming out soon. And then the week after that is probably the final week before Purim that we're going to learn together. We're going to finish off, that's the plan, to finish off the last 2 paragraphs, B'Shah Tovah, in a good and auspicious hour. Toda Rabba.